So, this is everything you're going to need to know about 1984, Part 3, Chapter 2. This is a long chapter. It opens up with Winston held down on some sort of elevated bed where he can't move at all, but he can't really tell how he's being held down. There's a super bright light on him, and OBrien's on one side and a man like a doctor with a syringe on the other. And he's felt kind of like he's floated up into the room and isn't really sure how long he's been out, unconscious. So we get some background about his captivity, but it has been a while. His memory is like just kind of broken up. He hasn't seen darkness or daylight since he's been in custody, and in his memory there's some big blank empty spots that he doesn't really know how much time has passed. And it started with the first hit on his elbow when the torture started coming on strong, and he had to confess, like basically everyone, for every crime under the sun. He doesn't know how many times he was beaten or for how long he was beaten and how each one lasted and how much space was in between. There'd be like 5 or 6 guards always hitting or kicking or beating him with sticks. Sometimes he'd lose consciousness, sometimes not. He'd cry out and confess right away sometimes, and sometimes he'd try to hold out before confessing, but he would always end up confessing to anything they wanted. He'd get beaten back to back, and sometimes there would be like a recovery time where he'd get a shave or some sort of medical attention to see if he had any broken bones. Eventually, the beating started to lessen, and it moved into a kind of like a questioning phase where he'd be questioned for hours on end, and he was always in slight pain where they would slap him or like twist his ears or something. They basically questioned him and pressed him into confessing everything so that he was totally confused, basically, kind of forced him into a nervous breakdown. And he tells us that, this process broke him more than the physical beatings. And he just wanted to find out what they wanted him to confess, and he would do it. So he ends up, confessing to everything from assassination, murdering his wife, even though she's still alive as far as he knows, being a spy, committing sabotage, being a pervert, you name it. And then he has other weird memories like hallucinations, which, he'd fall into these eyes like that were watching him, and he'd be rolling down a corridor towards room 101, laughing hysterically and yelling out these confessions, and around him were guards and questioners and Julia and OBrien, even Charrington. So we kind of take this as like a mental breakdown that he's having. The narrative picks up, though, where he's on this plank bed being held down, thinking he heard OBrien's voice. And he believes that OBrien was always nearby directing and deciding everything that happened to him. So Winston thinks that he heard OBrien whisper, telling him not to worry, that he's being watched over, and that OBrien's been watching over him for 7 years. We find out that even the back of Winston's head is being held down, and OBrien's looking down on him, and Winston reflects that OBrien kind of looks older than he thought, but OBrien's hand is on a dial, and OBrien reminds Winston that he had told him that this is where they would meet if they ever met again. Now all of a sudden OBrien flicks the dial, and Winston is flooded with this crazy pain that makes him feel like he's being torn apart, even though he doesn't really know how they're doing it or what's happening. But while it's happening, OBrien just kind of tells Winston exactly what Winston is thinking, that he's afraid in a moment his backbone is going to snap. OBrien turns off the dial, telling Winston that was the setting for 40, and the dial goes up to 100. And so if Winston lies or is stupid, he's going to receive this brutal pain. So OBrien then lectures Winston that he is worth the trouble that they are going through with him, but that Winston's problem is that he has like this defective memory. He remembers what is fake and forgets what is real, and that Winston thinks it's a positive thing, like he's proud of his own perspective, thinking that the party is crazy. He tells Winston that Winston could have cured himself but chose not to. So OBrien gets into this discussion about who Oceania is at war with. OBrien gets Winston to admit that they were at war with East Asia, but that Winston thinks a week before his arrest they were at war with Eurasia. Now, of course, the party would say this was never the case. The next example, O'Brien brings up is the picture of the 3 party members that Winston held as proof that the party was lying. He had a picture of them. O'Brien even holds this picture in front of Winston's eyes, and Winston tries to sit up, but he can't, crying like, oh my gosh, this photo exists. And Brian says, no, it doesn't. He puts it in the memory hole and tells Winston it doesn't exist and never has. When Winston brings it up, O'Brien just says, I have no memory of it. Right? So this totally messes with Winston. He's crushed, and he's like, this is doublethink. O'Brien, he doesn't know if O'Brien is lying, and we would think O'Brien's lying because he held up the picture, but O'Brien says he's not. And so is he using doublethink to forget that he had the picture, and then doublethink to forget that he made himself forget? O'Brien brings up the slogan about controlling the past and making Winston recite it, and this is it. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. The point O'Brien makes to Winston is that the past doesn't exist anywhere real except in records or in people's memory. But the party controls the records, and the party controls the memories of people, so the party controls the past. Winston kind of protests, right, saying that they haven't controlled his memory, but O'Brien, kind of puts the slap down on that, telling Winston that, no, Winston, you haven't controlled your memory, which is why you're where you're at. O'Brien tells Winston that Winston has not done what he was supposed to do, but reality is only in the human mind. It's not externally existing somewhere. So the only real reality is looking through the eyes of the party, and Winston has refused to do this. O'Brien tells him this is an effort of the will, it's an effort of self-destruction, and that is the only way to become sane. But that Winston has decided to be a nut bar, and that he's all alone. O'Brien asks Winston if he remembers writing in his diary about freedom being able to say 2 + 2 is 4. So this is going to be the benchmark, right? He holds up 4 fingers and asks Winston how many fingers are up. Winston replies there are 4. O'Brien asks how many are up if the party says that it is 5. Winston repeats it's 4. So O'Brien turns the dial up to 55. When O'Brien pulls the dial back a little and asks Winston again, Winston still says 4. O'Brien turns it up to 60 and asks again. Winston repeats 4, wondering how can he say anything else when O'Brien has 4 fingers up. Knowing the dial went up even more, all Winston can see now is O'Brien's face and 4 fingers. O'Brien keeps asking. Winston says 4 again, asking, how can this go on? So O'Brien asks again, so Winston finally says 5. But O'Brien says, I know you're lying, and thinks that you think they're 4, so he asks him again. So Winston's like, however many you want, 4 or 5, I don't care, just stop this pain. So all of a sudden, Winston is actually sitting up, and O'Brien's arm is around his shoulder, and he wonders if he passed out, right? But he's cold, and he's crying, and actually he's finding comfort by O'Brien having his arm around him, like O'Brien is his protector, and the pain O'Brien is causing is coming from somewhere else. So O'Brien tells Winston that he's a slow learner, and Winston doesn't know how he can help it when 2 + 2 = 4. O'Brien says that sometimes they are 4, but they can be 3 or 5 or 3, 4, and 5 all at the same time. But Winston just has to be, trying harder to be sane, right? He lays him back down and turns the dial back up again. And Winston says he thinks there are 4, but he's trying to see 5. So when O'Brien's like, are you really trying? Winston's like, yes, I am. Thinking the dial is up to 80 or 90 to the point, the fingers at that point with this much pain, he sees the fingers dancing in front of his eyes so that he can't count them. So O'Brien turns the dial back down and saying, okay, how many fingers? And at this point, Winston's brain is jiggled, so he's saying 5, 6, I don't know. But that if O'Brien does that again, it's going to kill him. So when Winston answers this way, O'Brien's like, better. Winston is then stuck with a needle and feels this bliss go through his body, so they drug him up. He looks up at O'Brien with gratitude and love. Despite the torture and pain, he feels O'Brien is someone who understands him and that he could talk to. O'Brien asks Winston where he is and why he's there. So Winston says he thinks he's in the ministry of love, probably for months, and that people are brought there to confess and be punished. Well, at this answer, a change comes over OBrien. He tells Winston that is not the reason, but that people are actually brought there to be cured. The party doesn't care about the crimes. The party cares about what people think, so they change their enemies into allies rather than kill them. He gets in Winston's face, and Winston basically thinks he's crazy. Backing off, OBrien tells him that they don't make the mistakes of past dictatorships or totalitarian regimes where people that were killed while resisting became heroes, became martyrs. The party doesn't allow that to happen. The crimes that are confessed are made true because they control the past, and then the people that confess are erased from existence so that no one will ever hear or remember Winston. So he will be a non-entity, a non-being. So Winston wonders, if you're going to do this, then why are you even bothering? But OBrien says, I know what you're thinking, and then tells him, you're thinking? Why do we even bother? So OBrien tells him they're bothering because Winston right now is a flaw outside of the system. And so what they basically do is they burn out the insides of non-believers, convert them, bring them into the fold of the party, and then they kill them. They're made perfect in the party's eyes before they're destroyed. OBrien tells Winston that the three men Winston thought he saw in the picture were completely purified by this process, and the only thing left of them was they felt bad for what they did, and they loved Big Brother, and they wanted to die while their minds were pure. So Winston's just blown away. He looks at OBrien in awe and sees this lunatic passion in OBrien's face and think that OBrien just knows everything that he thinks and feels. So maybe OBrien isn't the crazy one because Winston's mind is contained in OBrien's mind, and so maybe Winston's crazy. OBrien tells him that Winston will never escape them. Even if they allow him to live out his natural life, they're going to crush and suck everything out of him and everything that it means to be human, and they're going to fill him up with the party. OBrien says to the man in the white coat the number 3,000, and Winston feels what's almost like these cotton pads on his temples, and he's afraid that there's a new pain coming, but OBrien's like, this will not hurt. So Winston senses this blinding flash, this painless bomb goes off in his head, and that he'd been knocked on his back even though he was already on his back. And so OBrien starts asking him questions like, who are we at war with? But Winston can't remember. So OBrien starts giving him information that Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, that Winston made up a photo that supposedly proved the party was lying, and Winston basically agrees with everything he says. When he holds up 4 fingers and tells Winston he saw 5 and asks if he sees them, Winston says he does see 5, and he really did. All of a sudden his mind kind of clicks back in place, and he knows that there was a short time that everything OBrien said went to this empty place caused by the flash in his brain and became the truth. OBrien tells him that now Winston sees that what he's saying is actually possible. So OBrien seems satisfied with the process and reminds Winston that he'd written in the diary about this connection he felt with OBrien. OBrien tells him that he actually does enjoy talking to Winston, that Winston's mind reminds him of his mind, except that Winston is actually crazy. So OBrien allows Winston to ask him any questions he wants, and that the dial is switched off. So the first thing Winston does is he asks about Julia, and OBrien tells him that she betrayed him and came over to their side quickly, that she's totally different, everything was burned out of her, all of her rebelliousness, he wouldn't even recognize her. Next, Winston asks if Big Brother exists, and OBrien tells him he does, that the party exists, and Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. But Winston wants to know if Big Brother exists like Winston exists. OBrien's answer to that is that Winston does not exist. So Winston clarifies if Big Brother takes up space physically like Winston, and OBrien just says he exists and will never die. So Winston asks if the Brotherhood exists, but OBrien tells him that's something you will never know, and you will die not knowing that. So one more question Winston has, and that is, what is room 101? Well, OBrien tells Winston he already knows what's in it, that everyone knows. And with that, O'Brien signals the man in the white coat who gives Winston a shot that puts him to sleep, and that's the end of the chapter. Told you it was long. That's a lot. So quickly, what should you take from this chapter? It's a pretty crazy chapter, but Orwell is painting a picture of the mind of dictators and despots that at their core, they're insane. Just as the reader knows O'Brien and the party's view of reality is completely warped and just mad, tyrannical leaders that seek to impose their own distorted view on the world, their own countries, their own people, they're crazy. Orwell was able to see this played out in World War II. We sympathize with Winston, who we know is right, but he's powerless to counter-argue with insanity. You can't talk crazy into being sane, right? Insanity believes itself already to be sane. But Winston is physically, mentally, and emotionally unable to withstand the power that the party has over him, so he's systematically kind of torn down and built up into the image of the party. Orwell makes it obvious that the heart of totalitarian regimes is all about power and power over other people and controlling their lives and wanting to impose their reality, even though it's completely nuts, upon the rest of the world. So there you go. Hope that was helpful. I know it was long, but thanks for sticking with it. If you have questions, leave them in the comments. Please subscribe and like and share and all that good stuff. Until next time, we'll see you then.